From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Hi, my name is John Kelly. I'm a columnist in the Metro section of the Washington Post, and the Washington Post is proud to be a charter sponsor of the National Book Festival, which is where we all are today. There are a few things more difficult for a writer than taking challenging adult material and making it engaging and understandable to a young audience. I feel this way because I was the founding editor of Kids Post in the Post, and we struggled with that every day. But when it is done correctly, smartly, thoughtfully, respectfully, it is marvelous. And Phillip Hoose is marvelous. He won the 2009 National Book Award for Claudette Colvin, Twice Toward Justice. You've read it. If you haven't read it, it's about a teenage girl from Montgomery, Alabama, who months before Rosa Parks refused to move to the back of the bus. When I read that book, I kept saying to myself, how come I never knew this story? And how is it that Phillip Hoose tells it so well? He wrote about an entirely different sort of hero in Moonbird, A Year on the Wind with the great survivor B-95. B-95 is a Rufa redknot, a shorebird that scientists have been tracking for decades on its flight from Tierra del Fuego to the Arctic, a migration that includes an important refueling stop in Delaware Bay. Thanks to Phillip, I now know more about the sexual practices of horseshoe crabs than I ever thought I would. Phillip's picture book, Hey Little Ant, written with his daughter Hannah, has more than 1 million copies in print in 10 languages. Given that it's about empathy, a conversation between an ant and the boy who is pondering crushing it, it's exactly the sort of book you want to be read widely. Phillip's latest book is The Boys Who Challenged Hitler, Knud Pedersen and the Churchill Club. It tells the amazing true story of a group of Danish teenagers who during World War II fought the Nazi occupiers with acts of sabotage. In addition to being a respected award-winning writer, Phillip is a musician, a founding member of the Children's Music Network. He performs around Portland, Maine with his band Chipped Enamel. Like many writers, Phillip is a frequent speaker at schools around the country. I looked at some of the comments students left on his webpage. One 8th grader wrote, quote, "He's not like most writers that come in their best outfits. He came to Walton Middle School like a regular person." I'm pretty sure Phillip Hoose is not just a regular person. Please join me in welcoming him to the 2015 National Book Festival.
Thank you, John, for such a great introduction, and thanks to all of you for coming. I'll tell you a little bit about the backstory behind The Boys Who Challenged Hitler. I look for titles. I look for stories about young people who have made a difference, who have taken stands, who have nonfiction stories of kids who have really put their lives out there, as Claudette did. And I had just finished Moonbird and was wondering, what in the world am I going to do? And I was looking through a file, and there was this manila folder that I had in my office at home, and it just said Denmark. And there was one piece of paper in it, and it reminded me of a conversation. It was a conversation, an email exchange I had had with someone a dozen years ago in 2000. And in the year 2000, I took a bike trip to Denmark. And on the last day, I stopped at a War Resisters Museum in Copenhagen. And amidst all the exhibits about Danish courage in World War II, there was this little corner shrine to these kids who supposedly had started the resistance in World War II, the resistance against the German soldiers, the German army who came to occupy them. And these were kids, 13, 14, 15. It looked like maybe some of them had shaved, some of them hadn't. There were pictures. I went to the curator and said, "Any of these people still alive?" And he said, "The person you want to talk to is Knud Pedersen. here's his email address. He's been the spokesman for this group for many years. So I went back to Portland, Maine, where I live, typed out an email message to Knud Pedersen and said, I'm interested in a story like this and working with you. Any chance? And he wrote right back and said, no. No chance at all. I've already got this, licensed out to another writer. So he didn't exactly say, leave me alone and don't muddle things up, but that was it. It was very curt, So a dozen years later, I'm looking through these files after Moonbird, and there's the Denmark file with the one piece of paper and the 2 email messages in it, and I thought, what the heck? Maybe he's still alive, So I wrote, hey, I'm this guy, remember me? Are you still alive? And, he whistled a reply across the Atlantic Ocean and said, how did he say it? He said, deal fell through, can work with you now. When will you be in Copenhagen? And I wrote back, I looked at my calendar, I wrote back and said, I can come from October 7th to October 14th. This was 2012. And wow, right back across the Atlantic it came, fine. I shall meet you at the airport, you shall stay with us, So I went with my wife, Sandy, and there he was in the airport. It was unmistakable who he was. He's 6'5". He had a great head of distinguished, gray hair. He had neck wear. He was very theatrical with his presence, and got us in the car right away and zoomed us away. I spent the next week with him, 8 hours a day, just staring at this guy, talking with him, asking him questions. And then I had the opportunity for the next year and a half, talk about a primary source, just to email, whatever I wanted to ask him, to ask him to critique the things that I wrote, to say, is anything incorrect? So it's a remarkable story of kids with courage. And what I'd like to do now is show you a little trailer and then narrate some slide images for you, please.
What would you do if your breakfast was interrupted by the invasion of your country?
I was 14 years old when the German military invaded and attacked Denmark with practically no resistance.
What if the adults said it was for the best, told you to keep quiet, told you not to resist? But what if those invaders were the mightiest force on earth, Adolf Hitler's German army?
We young people were very frustrated and furious that the grown-up people didn't do anything.
Knud Pedersen, his brother Jens, and a group of teenage classmates mounted their bicycles to confuse, to confound, to disarm, and to sabotage their Nazi occupiers. Every gun stolen from a German officer's holster, every vehicle set on fire, each explosion brought the boys closer to capture and their possible execution. They were the boys that challenged Hitler. Could you do the same?
Thank you. All right. And indeed, it was just as the trailer said. On April 9th, 1940, the Pedersen family was eating breakfast, as where everybody else in Denmark, when they heard a tremendous roar in the air, and they looked up, and there were planes flying wingtip to wingtip, and they dropped leaflets. This leaflet, which says basically, alert. Good news, you are now a protectorate of the German army. You're going to love this. Everything is fine. Go back to work, go back to school. And the deal that was laid before the Danish government was, you can go along with us and feed our troops, and provide us transportation, help us in our efforts, or else, we will destroy you. And they decided in a few hours to accede to those terms. And within no time at all, Denmark's major cities were just filled with German soldiers. What Hitler wanted with Denmark, he wanted to gain the cooperation of Denmark without putting boots on the ground. He didn't want to have to waste troops because he had bigger fish to fry. He valued Norway because it was an agricultural country, and he needed food for his soldiers. But I think even more so, they needed iron ore to make their weapons. And there were great iron mines in Sweden. They were connected by a road to a port in Norway called Narvik, from which ships sailed along the coast of Norway, and then Denmark, and then into German ports like Hamburg. And so he needed access to those fields, and he wanted troops up there to guard those fields because the iron ore was turned into weapons, and it was absolutely critical to Hitler's ambitions in the war. So the city of Aalborg, which was the northernmost city closest to the iron mines and so forth, was very important to him. Here are some people, German troops landing at the Aalborg airport, which they secured. And the average Danish people were unhappy with this result, but rather than fighting, there was little call for fighting. They tried to keep their spirits up by gathering at corners and singing Danish patriotic folk songs, by walking alongside the king as he rode his horse in the mornings every day, and by wearing these badges called king's badges of jewelry to, rally for Denmark. But besides just an occupation, the Germans were very happy to be in Denmark because there were deals to be done, and Danish collaborators also did things like build runways and airplane hangars and weapons in Denmark, and then the Danes cooperated, and the Germans actually paid them. So it was a pretty sweet deal. Here's a shot of Werner Best on the right, the German representative up there, and a Danish official, and they took their walk every morning too, and deals were cut. Knud Pedersen lived in a monastery in Aalborg, the city that I told you about, and he was the son, he and his brother Jens, the sons of a minister, a Protestant minister in Aalborg. So that's why they lived in this big, spooky, drafty old monastery that was built in 1506. Knud and his brother started school, and they were determined. They formed a determination. They were absolutely furious with the government's sort of surrendering to the Germans, especially since the Germans on the same day went on and dropped the same leaflets over Norway, and Norway decided to fight. They fought back and took terrible punishment. And Knud and his brother were very embarrassed about this. They just thought that their government was behaving cowardly. And they wanted to do something but didn't know quite what to do. And there was a meeting on just before Christmas in 1941 of some kids. They were sort of 8th graders, maybe 7 or 8 of them at the school. And it started out as a meeting, what are we going to give our teachers for Christmas? And it suddenly just stopped and snapped back into what was on everybody's mind, and that was the occupation of their country, of Denmark. And they got madder and madder, angrier and angrier, and they made a decision, and I'll read to you what they all smoked. They all smoked tobacco, and they were all indebted to the littlest. There's a blonde boy in front whose name was Borgia. His father owned a tobacco company, and the reason he got into the gang was because they could get free tobacco all the time. And in that meeting, they said, the air was thick with our tobacco smoke by the time we laid the proposition on the table. We will act. We will behave as Norwegians. We will clean the mud off the Danish flag. Together on that snowy afternoon, we middle A classmates, along with Jens, resolved to form a club to fight the Germans as fiercely as the Norwegians were fighting. We would take the resistance to Aalborg. We would call ourselves the Churchill Club, after the great British leader Winston Churchill. Jens volunteered to research the organization of a resistance cell and give us his recommendations, same time, same place tomorrow. Already transformed from the cheerful holiday shoppers we had been an hour before, the Churchill Club stood adjourned. So they made up their minds that they were going to do something about this, but they really didn't know how to do it. They had no military training. There was no army to teach them. You know, if you join an army, you get boot camp, where your personality is sort of stripped down and rebuilt in the form of a warrior. But these guys had never handled guns. They'd never really thought of being in an army, and they kind of didn't know what to do at the very first. So they started with acts of vandalism. It was a period that Knud Pedersen told me he called it learning to breathe. Because he said when you face danger, when you operate among armed soldiers who are your enemies, your pulse races, your diaphragm spasms. He said these kids felt the fear, the terrible fear of this. One thing they did was they made their own insignia. They took the swastika and put blue arrows at the ends of it. And they started with vandalism. They started painting up cars and German military vehicles and so forth. And then after, maybe 3 or 4 weeks of this, they realized they weren't catching the Germans' attention. They weren't doing anything by snipping telephone wires between the barracks and headquarters and turning directional signs around so the Germans knew to Aalborg would get lost. This was all pretty good stuff to do, but it wasn't good enough. So they decided they needed to destroy something. They needed to catch the Germans' attention. So they all rode out on their bikes one night. They struck by bicycle, and they struck by daylight because they all had curfews. They pretended that there was a bridge game at night when they really had to go out, and there was one kid among them whose family didn't have a telephone, and they all said they were going over to that person's house. And one night they rode their bicycles out through the snow in December in Denmark, miles to the airport, got in through the airport fence and set fire to the Fuchs Construction Company, which was a collaborator building runways for the Germans. And this is what the place looked like. They destroyed cars with gasoline, put it in the tanks, and set fire to the automobiles. In this picture, they have taken they discovered the use of grenades, and they blew up a railroad car that was filled with airplane parts and instructions for how to put them together. They reached a point where they convinced themselves that they needed more weapons, and so they put everything else aside and started accumulating weapons. They stole a machine gun from barracks. A German soldier had his back turned, and Knud went in and grabbed it and handed it to somebody else, and they relayed the gun away. They stole grenades, they stole rifles. They amassed quite an arsenal, which they kept in the basement. And for about 6 months, they struck again and again and again and again. They didn't know how to shoot guns, and so they waited until on Sunday mornings, Reverend Pedersen's church services would get loud when there were songs, and they would wait for the loudest moments to operate their machine guns and practice firing at bales of hay up in the loft of the monastery. They were just making it all up as they went. And at first, the Germans didn't notice, but when your cars and your equipment are damaged, they did take notice. And they said to the officials in Aalborg, they said, look, we've been letting you run your government, run your police, and so forth, but the Gestapo, our police, our German police, are going to step in and take over this if you don't find out who's doing this and find out fast and stop them. So they brought in 2 expert detectives from Copenhagen, and it took them a couple months more to narrow it down to the school, the cathedral school and the monastery. And where they met their fate was here at a sort of a donut shop. It's a pastry. And the German officers developed a great sweet tooth for Danish pastries. They loved it. They would go in these pastry stores and hang up their coats on a rack, and also hang up their holsters with their German Lugers, their guns, sometimes. And Knud and his friends would go in and steal the weapons. One waitress saw this happen and ratted on the boys. And the next day at school, there were German agents. And they were arrested. They found the arsenal of weapons, and all these were turned in. That's how I have these photographs, or how Knud has them. Is they were the evidence photographs that the police took. And they were all captured within one day. They had been out for about 6 months, creating acts of sabotage and acts of vandalism, but now they were behind bars in a prison in Aalborg, the city jail. And it caught all of Denmark by surprise. Everyone was shocked. Even though the Germans were censoring the newspapers, it made the news. Here is an article in the newspaper talking about the arrest. And Germany was, the Danes were alarmed because they didn't know what would happen to these kids. First of all, they didn't know who would conduct the trial of these saboteurs. Would it be the Germans? Would it be the Danes? Would these boys be executed? That was the big question that raced throughout all of Denmark in May of 1942, when these boys were captured. The Germans thought it over and said that they would go ahead and let the Danes run the trial as long as the principal of the school that they all went to was expelled from the country, because they blamed him for letting this happen, even though he had no knowledge of it and nothing to do with it, and that there would be a German observer in the court trial. And so here they are in the Aalborg jail. The boys on the right were 3 older boys that joined them late in the game. And the minute they got in jail, their minds were just fixed on escaping. They were not going to be contained, and they were not going to be executed. And so the first thing they did was they tried to rip a hole in some mesh that covered their playground, their not playground, but their yard, their outdoor exercise yard. And Knud was tall enough to lift a kid up, and they kept expanding the hole. Well, one time a jail guard looked up, saw the hole, and that was it. They were punished. The second thing they did, though, was more successful. A boy smuggled in a hacksaw in a magazine, and it got into one of the cells with Jens Pedersen, Knud's brother, and 2 of those older boys, and they started sawing, and they could only do it by daytime because the jail was quiet at night, and it made so much noise that they had to make noise as the sawing was taking place. So they started singing songs over and over and over, and the number 1 hit that they sang went, Hitler, he only has 1 ball, Goering has 2 but very small, Himmler has something similar, and Colonel Goebbels has no balls at all. They sang it over and over and over as these kids in the cell were sawing, and they got a piece out of the middle bar, and they were smart enough not to just do that. They left prongs on either end so it could be fitted back in, because what they wanted to do was go outside the jail, commit acts of sabotage, and come back to the jail until they could figure out a way to get to Sweden, which was sort of the ultimate goal. 17 nights in a row, these kids went out, wandered around, destroyed German property, and the Germans were scratching their heads. Wow, I thought you said we had taken care of this problem. But no, they hadn't. And on the 17th night, they were found out at 4 a.m. in the streets of Aalborg. An air raid siren went off, and the police saw them and nailed them and took them back to the jail. And the jailers were what? Wait, they're over here. We've got them in the cell. And they went to the cell, and of course they weren't there. It was pretty tough. The kids, the 7 kids from Cathedral School who were younger, were taken to a state penitentiary in Nyborg and treated very, very harshly, very cruelly. They almost starved. Just a real tough time. But meanwhile, while they were in jail, while they were in prison, the resistance picked up. And, you know, when I saw that museum exhibit back in Copenhagen, they said that these boys had inspired the Danish resistance, that they were the first to resist. And as these boys, having been the first to resist, were in jail, the revolution, the stand against the Germans caught momentum, and it became a big deal. And Danes cooperated with the British, who did night airdrops of weapons in canisters in farm fields, and the weapons were distributed. And here are pictures of them, and there were fights in the streets. Workers refused to work for the Germans. They really got their courage up and swelled themselves up and acted very bravely as these kids were in jail. Well, Knud and his brother were the last ones out. They all spent between a year and a half and 2 years and 2 months in a state penitentiary. And they were the last, the Pedersen brothers were the last ones out. And when they got back home in 1944, the Denmark that they saw was a lot different than the Denmark that they had left. It was a Denmark that was standing up, its chest out, fighting back, and the war had turned. The most famous and maybe admirable thing that the Danish citizens did was to transport maybe 80% of the Jewish population of Denmark to Sweden in a flotilla of boats, small fishing boats for the most part. It's been written about many times in books like Number the Stars, but it's a remarkable bit of courage. On May 5th, 1945, the Germans surrendered, and it was Liberation Day. The boys, while they were in jail, became famous around the world. This is a true comic book from the United States. It's in 1943 about the Danish the boy saboteurs, as they became called. And when the war was over, the political and military leaders wanted to meet them and thank them. This is General Dooling, who had been the chief of British forces in that part of the world, meeting with them. Knud is he's the tall boy just to his left there in that picture. And they got the biggest thrill, I think, when they got a chance to meet Winston Churchill himself. Churchill went to Copenhagen for another reason, and during the flight over, they told him the story of the Churchill Club, which he had not known, and he said, I've got to meet these people. So they rounded up all that could be rounded up, and Churchill agreed to a military dress parade, treating them like soldiers, which they had all wanted to be. And they only met once after that, 5 years later in 1950, and they took a group picture. Here they all were, looking quite presentable. And what I wanted to read something. I had quite a wonderful experience working with Knud Pedersen. We became very close. We signed our messages, our email messages, love, and I really meant it. And I think he did too. And this is a note I put in the book. Knud was in his late 80s when we worked on this book. He was in fine health to begin with, but there was always a sense that we had better move fast. for we did not know how much time we had left. We wrote email messages back and forth nearly every day, even on weekends, me forwarding drafts from my office in Maine, Knud responding from his art library in Copenhagen. Just before Christmas 2013, a week went by with no word from Knud. This was unprecedented and ominous. I wrote again and again with no response. Finally, on January 3rd, 2014, he tapped out a message from a hospital bed. Pneumonia had nearly taken his life. He said he had actually felt the presence of death in his room. I had the feeling that a shadow was walking softly around me, he wrote, looking for a good place to get through for a final blow. I told it to wait, because you and I were not yet done with our work. I think our work kept me alive. Now I am fit to fight on. So we fought on, finishing the book in the late autumn of 2014. Knud was delighted. The first thing I did after I read it, he said, was to forward it to my children and grandchildren. And then in early December 2014, Knud again fell silent for more than a week. On December 12th, he reported from his bed, "I am losing weight dramatically and have no appetite and no energy." After a series of tests, puzzled doctors prepared Knud for a full-body scan. The prospect of entering a narrow tube terrified him. Imprisonment at Nyborg had left him claustrophobic, afraid of being confined. Throughout his life, he had refused to take an airplane or even ride in an elevator. "The doctors say that I am fragile," Knud observed in one of the last notes I received from him. "But how fragile can one be who, in 89 years, has lived in this most cruel century anybody could dream of? I will keep you updated." Knud Pedersen died after midnight, December 18, 2014. He was treated as a national hero, buried in Copenhagen's Assistens Cemetery, alongside other Danish figures such as Hans Christian Andersen and Søren Kierkegaard. So I think I will stop now and answer questions if you have any. Well, I'm not going to do that because I have a message that I'm over my allotted time, so let me just say one more thing. I agreed to say this. The National Endowment for the Humanities has made a terrific list of great nonfiction books. It's a terrific comprehensive list. I have 2 titles on it myself. You can find out more about it at www.neh.gov. I'm sorry to have gone over my time. I just get into this. So thank you very much.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.